The late afternoon sky in Montana had turned golden when Harlan Buckridge heard the distant neighs. He was finishing up stacking hay bales near the old barn when the sound cut through the quiet like a warning. It wasn't one of his horses. He knew them all by voice. Wiping his hands on his jeans, he grabbed his hat tighter and followed the sound, boots crunching over dry dirt. Something in his gut twisted, a sense that something was off. As he rounded the northern fence line, he stopped dead in his tracks. 3 unfamiliar horses stood just beyond the edge of the pasture, side by side like statues. The first, a strong, alert chestnut with a white blaze, locked eyes with him. That one he'd soon name Rusty Embermane. Next to him, a pale white horse with a calm, faraway look in its eyes, Prairie Ghost. And at the center, standing proud and still like a shadow brought to life, was a jet-black stallion, Midnight Halter. No brands, no ropes, no signs of panic. But there was something in their eyes, something mournful, almost human. Harlan approached slowly, hands out, voice low. "Easy now. Who do you boys belong to?" Midnight Halter stepped forward and pressed his muzzle into Harlan's palm. It felt less like greeting and more like recognition. That's when he saw it, near the horse's hooves, half buried in the dry soil. A footprint. Small. Too small for a man. He crouched down. A child's footprint. And right next to it, a red ribbon, dirty, frayed, and tangled in weeds. He picked up the ribbon gently, heart pounding. It wasn't just lost. It had been there a while, weeks, maybe more. He scanned the area. No tire tracks, no broken fences, no other footprints. Just these 3 horses, standing guard. The wind picked up, lifting dust into the air, and for a brief second it sounded like a whisper carried on the breeze. Harlan stood up slowly, eyes fixed on the footprint. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. He led the horses back toward the barn, his pulse still racing. Rusty Embermane let out a soft whinny as he stepped inside. Prairie Ghost hesitated briefly, glancing back. Midnight Halter paused longest, staring at the spot where the footprint had been, as if saying goodbye. Harlan latched the gate shut with a loud click, that echo ringing louder than it should have. Inside the barn, as the light dimmed and the shadows stretched long across the dirt floor, Harlan couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The footprint. The ribbon. The eyes of those horses. None of it was random. And deep down, he knew, whatever had brought them here, wasn't done yet. The barn was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet Harlan Buckridge was used to. It felt like the air was holding its breath. The 3 horses, Rusty Embermane, Prairie Ghost, and Midnight Halter, stood still inside their temporary stalls, watching him with an unsettling intensity. Harlan moved methodically, checking their hooves, brushing their coats, feeding them fresh hay, but his thoughts were elsewhere. That footprint haunted him. It wasn't just a mystery. It stirred something buried deep in his memory, a story he thought the prairie had swallowed a long time ago. As he shut the stall doors, the creak of an old pickup broke the silence. Marlowe Granger, Harlan's neighbor, pulled up with a bed full of lumber for the pasture fence. Marlowe was a man of few words and even fewer surprises, but when he saw the horses, his eyes narrowed, and he went pale. "Those horses," he muttered, stepping out of his truck. "Where'd you find them?" Harlan told him. "The pasture. No brands. No signs of an owner. Just that footprint and the ribbon." Marlowe walked over, knelt by the barn door, and ran a weathered hand through his thinning hair. "You ever hear of the Claiborne place? Up past the Cedar Ridge." Harlan nodded slowly. Everyone in the valley had heard of Vernon Claiborne, the reclusive old man who disappeared with his granddaughter nearly 10 years ago. No trace, no answers. Just silence. The land was abandoned, left to rot with the ghosts of its last residents. "That white horse," Marlowe said, pointing. "That's Prairie Ghost. Belonged to the girl, Eliza Thornvale. I remember her riding him up and down the ridge when she was just a kid. She loved that horse like it was part of her." The words hit Harlan like a kick to the chest. These horses weren't just strays, they were survivors. And maybe witnesses. Before he could respond, another engine approached. An old sheriff's truck. Dawson Kettering, long since retired, stepped out slowly, cane in hand. His face hardened when he saw the horses. "I never thought I'd see them again," he said quietly. He moved toward the stalls and stopped in front of Midnight Halter. He was Vernon's. Mean and smart as hell, but loyal to a fault. Dawson looked over at Harlan. "You said you found a footprint?" Harlan nodded and showed him the ribbon. Dawson didn't speak for a long moment. "If the horses came back, maybe she's trying to come back too," he whispered. The weight of that possibility settled heavily between them. No one had spoken Eliza's name in years, not out loud. Now her horse was here. And maybe something else was too. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Harlan sat at the edge of his bed, boots still on, staring through the cracked windowpane into the darkness beyond the barn. The horses hadn't made a sound since sunset. Not even a snort. Just silence, thick, watchful, as if they were listening for something. He kept going over Dawson's words. Maybe she's trying to come back. But from where? And why now? He poured himself a glass of rye and opened the drawer beside his bed. Inside was an old map of the region, the kind ranchers used to track water sources and cattle paths. His fingers traced the faded ink until they stopped at a small black square just beyond the cedar ridge. The Claiborne property. His father used to call it cursed land. Harlan had always dismissed it as superstition, but tonight something gnawed at his gut. Why would horses, gone for a decade, suddenly return without warning? The next morning, he saddled up rusty Embermane and rode out early. The sky was gray, and the wind was still. As he crossed the ridge, the land grew quiet, even the birds holding their breath. When the Claiborne house came into view, Harlan pulled the reins. The place looked like time had forgotten it. Paint peeling off the porch. Shutters hanging crooked. The barn door swayed slightly, even though there was no wind. Rusty snorted uneasily beneath him. Inside the house, the air was stale, thick with dust and something else. A sadness that clung to the walls. Harlan moved slowly through the living room. Toys lay scattered under a broken piano. A child's jacket still hung by the door. Nothing had been packed or taken. It was like they'd vanished mid-breath. In the back room, beneath a warped floorboard, he found something that stopped him cold, a small wooden box, wrapped in cloth. Inside the box was a photograph. Eliza, maybe 10 years old, smiling beside Prairie Ghost. Next to it, a drawing in crayon. Her, Vernon, and the 3 horses, with a red ribbon in Eliza's hair. But it was the note folded in half at the bottom that made Harlan's hands go cold. Just 5 words, scribbled in childish handwriting. He said not to tell. As he left the house, something caught his eye. Fresh footprints in the mud beside the barn. Small. Human. Recent. Harlan froze. He looked around, but saw no one. The horses hadn't just returned with memories. They'd come carrying a truth that was still alive, and hiding somewhere close. Back at the ranch, the atmosphere had changed. Even the wind seemed different, quieter, but heavier. The 3 horses remained strangely still in the barn, as if they were waiting for something to happen. Harlan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by a person, but by the land itself. Prairie Ghost, normally calm, paced restlessly in his stall, occasionally lifting his head to stare at the barn's back wall, ears perked. Harlan had seen animals react to storms. This wasn't that. This was fear. He fed them and checked their water, but something near Midnight Halter's stall made him stop. In the dirt just outside the stall gate, there was a boot print. Not his. Smaller, lighter, but not from a child. Someone else had been in the barn while he was gone. The print was fresh, the edges still sharp. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They had stood there, watching. He turned quickly, grabbed his rifle from the hook by the door, and scanned the horizon. Nothing. Just rolling hills, distant fences, and the ever-present silence. He knew the neighbors were miles out, and no one passed through this stretch of land without being noticed, unless they knew how to stay invisible. And only one man came to mind, Vernon Claiborne. But Vernon was gone. Or was supposed to be. That night, as Harlan sat near the barn, the lamplight flickering beside him, he heard it. A voice. Soft, almost a whisper, coming from inside the barn. He stood slowly, holding his breath. It wasn't the wind, it was too clear. A child's voice, speaking low. He crept toward the barn doors, rifle in hand. As he pushed them open, the voice stopped. Prairie Ghost stared at him with wide eyes. Behind the stalls, nothing. No one. But then, from the far corner, something shifted. A small shadow darted between hay bales. Harlan raised his lantern, heart pounding. "Who's there?" he called out, voice firm but controlled. No response. He stepped forward, cautiously, and noticed a patch of loose straw near the wall. As he knelt down to move it aside, he felt the unmistakable chill of eyes on his back. In the straw he found another red ribbon, just like the first one, but newer. Cleaner. It hadn't been there before. He stood up quickly, turning on his heel, but saw only horses and shadows. Whoever, or whatever, had been there had vanished again. But they'd left a message. Eliza wasn't just a memory. And Vernon Claiborne, he might not be as dead as the valley believed. The next morning the barn was quiet again, but not peaceful. The silence felt like a warning now. Harlan barely slept. He kept the red ribbon clenched in his fist most of the night, trying to make sense of everything. The whispering voice, the footprints, the shadow in the hay. He knew what fear looked like in animals, and Midnight Halter had stood alert at his stall the entire night, ears trained on the back wall, as if expecting someone to return. Harlan saddled rusty Embermane just after dawn. He needed to go back to the Claiborne property. Something there hadn't finished speaking to him. Before he mounted up, he noticed something strange tucked into Prairie Ghost's saddlebag, which he had never touched. A folded piece of paper, aged and brittle. Carefully, he opened it. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably a child's. "If he comes back, don't let him in. He isn't my grandpa anymore." No name. No date. Just dread soaked into every letter. His pulse quickened. Eliza had written this. But when? And what did she mean, "He isn't my grandpa anymore"? Harlan swallowed hard and looked toward the cedar ridge in the distance. That letter confirmed what he'd feared since the horses showed up. Something had happened out there that went beyond a missing person case. There was darkness tied to Vernon Claiborne, a kind people didn't speak about. Maybe even something evil. As he rode up the ridge again, the air seemed colder. Rusty grew uneasy, ears flicking, hooves hesitant. Birds didn't sing here. Trees didn't sway. It was as if the land itself was afraid. Harlan dismounted at the edge of the property and moved slowly toward the barn. But then he froze. On the windowsill of the house, half hidden in the vines, was a small wooden horse. Hand-carved. Painted red. Exactly like the kind Eliza used to make at the county fair. He approached, hand trembling, and reached for it. That's when he heard a twig snap behind him. He spun around, rifle raised. Nothing. But he felt it. Someone was there. Watching. Not from the house, but from the tree line. His eyes scanned the woods, and for a split second he saw movement. A figure. Tall. Still. Wearing an old, tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Just enough to stir an old memory. "Vernon," Harlan whispered, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. But the figure was already gone, swallowed by the trees like smoke. Harlan didn't return straight home. Instead, he circled around the back of the Claiborne house, heart pounding, rifle still in hand. The figure he saw, tall, motionless, watching from the trees, had vanished as if it were never there. But the feeling it left behind clung to him like the cold. He knew what he'd seen. And if it truly was Vernon Claiborne, then something was terribly wrong. That man should not be alive. Not after what the town believed. Behind the house, tangled in weeds and overgrowth, sat the entrance to the old root cellar, a storm shelter built into the earth. Harlan remembered it from childhood. Locals always whispered about what Vernon kept down there. Most assumed canned goods, hunting gear, maybe even bootleg whiskey. But some said Vernon had secrets buried deeper than the foundation. Harlan hesitated. Then, pushing aside the brush, he lifted the heavy wooden hatch. The hinges groaned like they hadn't moved in years. The air that rushed out was stale and damp, carrying the faint scent of rot and something else. Mildew, maybe, or something worse. He descended the wooden steps, lantern raised. The cellar was small, lined with shelves of long-expired jars. But in the back corner, behind a rotting mattress, was something unexpected, a locked door, metal, bolted shut. Not part of the original structure. It looked newer, out of place. Harlan's pulse quickened. Why would a man like Vernon need a locked room underground? He examined the handle, rusted but intact. Nearby, half hidden under a tarp, he found a set of keys. One of them was smaller, older, more worn. His hands trembled as he slid it into the lock. It clicked. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow room barely 6 feet wide. Inside, he found a small wooden chair, children's drawings tacked to the wall, a dusty stuffed rabbit on the floor, and a name carved into the stone by hand, Eliza. His throat tightened. This wasn't a shelter. It was a prison. Every instinct in his body screamed that something had lived here. Or worse, had been kept here. He stepped back, stomach churning. The space was too quiet. Too still. Then, as he turned to leave, he noticed one more thing, a faint scrape on the inside of the door, as if someone had clawed at it from within. Back above ground, daylight had begun to fade. But before he could mount Rusty and ride home, he saw it again, that same figure in the distance, now closer. This time, he was sure, it was Vernon Claiborne. And Vernon was smiling. Harlan froze. The shape standing at the edge of the field didn't move, it just stood there, half-shadowed by the trees, hat low over the eyes. Vernon Claiborne. The same face Harlan had seen in old photographs and town records, unchanged, like time had forgotten to touch him. A wide-brimmed hat. A long, tattered coat. Boots caked in dried mud. But it wasn't the clothing that chilled Harlan, it was the smile. A slow, unnatural curve, stretched too far across a face that looked far too calm. "Vernon," Harlan called, voice dry, rifle lowered just slightly. No answer. The figure didn't flinch. He stepped forward, cautiously. "Where's Eliza?" he asked, louder this time. The name seemed to ripple across the field like wind through tall grass, but Vernon didn't react. Instead, he turned, slowly, and walked back toward the tree line without a word. Harlan moved to follow, but by the time he crossed the field, the man had vanished, again. Back at the ranch, Harlan's nerves were raw. The barn was silent except for the shuffling of hooves. He poured a strong drink and tried to clear his mind, but his thoughts were louder than any wind outside. The room under the cellar. The drawings. The letter. And now Vernon, alive? Or something else entirely? It didn't add up. He needed help. Someone who had been there before everything went wrong. Someone who might still carry the truth, even if they never wanted to speak it. The next morning, he drove out to the edge of the valley to find Dawson Kettering, the retired sheriff. Dawson didn't answer the door right away, but when he did, the look on his face said he already knew what Harlan had come for. "You saw him, didn't you?" the old man asked, voice barely above a whisper. Harlan nodded. Dawson stepped aside and let him in. The house smelled like pipe smoke and old paper. On the wall hung a faded photo, Eliza as a little girl, seated on Prairie Ghost, with Vernon standing behind her, one hand on her shoulder. Dawson poured coffee, sat down, and stared into his cup for a long moment. They always thought Vernon was just off. But I think he changed after his wife died. Started keeping secrets. Kept Eliza away from school. Said the world was dangerous. Harlan leaned forward. "You think he hurt her?" Dawson looked up slowly. "I think he didn't let her go. I think she's still out there, Harlan. And I don't think she's alone." Outside the window, a faint neigh echoed through the trees. Harlan left Dawson's house with more questions than answers. The drive back to the ranch felt longer than usual, his thoughts spinning with fragments of memories, warnings, and that strange smile Vernon had worn in the field. He couldn't shake Dawson's final words. "I think she's still out there, and I don't think she's alone." Alone? What did that mean? Was Vernon keeping someone else hidden too? Or had Eliza grown into someone the valley no longer recognized? Back at the barn, the horses were uneasy. Midnight Halter paced in his stall, ears pinned back, occasionally letting out a deep, low snort. Prairie Ghost stood with his head pressed against the wall, like he was listening for something. Rusty Embermane pawed at the ground. Something was different. The air was thick. As Harlan stepped inside, he felt it too, like the barn was holding its breath again. And then he heard it, a soft knock beneath the floorboards. At first, he thought it was just creaking from the old structure. But then it came again, 3 gentle knocks. Deliberate. Rhythmic. He crouched beside the feed bin and pressed his ear to the floor. Silence. Then, softly, a whisper, "Help me." Harlan shot up, heart pounding. It was a girl's voice. Faint. Muffled. Coming from beneath the barn. He ran to the back wall and moved aside a stack of crates. Behind them, half hidden, was a trapdoor covered in dust and straw. The hinges groaned as he opened it. A narrow set of wooden steps led into darkness. He grabbed a lantern, lit it, and began to descend. The air grew colder with each step, and the space smelled of earth and damp wood. At the bottom, he found a narrow hallway lined with stone, leading to what looked like a crawlspace, low, cramped, and silent. He knelt and crawled forward, the lantern casting flickering shadows. And then, in the far corner, he saw her. A girl, barely a teenager, huddled in a thin blanket. Eyes wide. Hair long and tangled. Dirt smudged across her cheeks. But it was her. Eliza Thornvale. Alive. She didn't speak at first. Just stared at him like she wasn't sure if he was real. Harlan whispered, "It's okay. I'm here." Her lips trembled. And then, quietly, she spoke. "He said if I left, he'd come for me." Her eyes shifted toward the ceiling. Toward the world above. Toward Vernon. Suddenly, a thud echoed above them, loud and heavy. The horses whinnied in panic. And someone began to walk across the barn floor. The footsteps above were slow and heavy, deliberate in their rhythm. Harlan froze, crouched beside Eliza in the cold crawlspace beneath the barn. Her breathing quickened, eyes fixed on the ceiling above them. "That's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He always walks like that. One foot drags, the right one." Harlan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. He could feel how cold her skin was. How long had she been down here? Days? Weeks? He held his breath and listened. The footsteps moved across the barn floor, stopped directly over the trapdoor, then turned. The wood above them creaked. Vernon hadn't come looking to talk. He came to finish something. And he knew exactly where to look. Harlan extinguished the lantern quickly. Darkness swallowed them, but at least it gave them silence. Eliza huddled closer. "He talks to himself now," she said softly. "He says I'm not real anymore. That the girl he raised died, and I'm just something left behind." Harlan's mind raced. He had no weapon. His rifle was leaning against the wall near the barn entrance. But if he stayed hidden, Vernon might find the trapdoor and corner them. If he left Eliza and went up alone, Vernon could turn on him. But if he did nothing, they'd both be caught in the dark. He whispered, "Is there another way out?" Eliza nodded slowly. "There's a hatch behind the wall. He built it, in case someone ever came for us." That sentence landed heavy. Vernon had been preparing for this, preparing for someone to come for his prisoner. Crawling low, they moved toward the back of the crawlspace, navigating tight turns and exposed roots. The horses above continued to stomp and whinny in distress. They knew Vernon was there. When Harlan reached the hidden panel, he felt around and pulled it loose. Beyond it, a tunnel opened into the earth, narrow but passable. "Go," he whispered. "Now." Eliza crawled ahead, moving with urgency. Harlan followed, glancing back once. A shadow appeared near the trapdoor opening. The sound of it creaking open shattered the silence. Vernon had found it. "Eliza," he called out, his voice like splintered wood. "You can run, but you're mine. You always were." Harlan pushed her forward. The tunnel led to a field behind the barn, overgrown and hidden from view. Light broke through the end. "Freedom!" "Keep going!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the narrow passage. Then he turned back, just for a second, and saw the outline of Vernon lowering himself into the crawlspace, eyes burning. And in that moment Harlan knew only one of them was getting out. The tunnel opened into the field behind the barn just as the first light of morning broke over the hills. Dew sparkled on the grass, and for a brief second it almost looked like the world hadn't changed. But Harlan knew it had. Eliza collapsed into the tall weeds, gasping, blinking against the light like someone who hadn't seen the sky in years. He knelt beside her, brushing dirt from her face. "You're safe," he whispered. "You're free." But part of her still didn't believe it. Behind them, inside the tunnel, the sound of scraping boots echoed louder. Vernon was coming. Closer now. No more games. No more hiding. Harlan turned and stood, positioning himself between Eliza and the crawlspace. There was no rifle, no weapon, just him. A man with nothing but the will to end something that had gone on far too long. The earth trembled slightly beneath his feet as Vernon's shadow appeared in the mouth of the tunnel. But then a sound, louder than the footsteps, rose from the barn. A deep, crashing noise, followed by panicked whinnies. Smoke began to drift upward. The barn was on fire. Somehow, in the chaos, a lantern must have tipped. Flames spread fast through the dry wood. The horses cried out. And that's when Vernon turned, hesitated, looking toward the sound of the animals he'd once controlled. Harlan didn't wait. He lunged back into the tunnel and slammed the crawlspace door shut, wedging a fallen timber across it. Dust filled the air. Smoke bled into the earth. Behind the door, Vernon screamed, not in pain, but in rage. Like a man whose grip on the world was finally breaking. "She's mine," he bellowed. "She'll always be mine." But he was wrong. Harlan ran back to Eliza, grabbed her hand, and they moved quickly away from the burning barn. By the time they reached the ridge, the flames were licking the roof. Midnight Halter, Rusty Embermane, and Prairie Ghost had kicked through their stalls and bolted into the open, galloping free across the valley like spirits finally released. Later, Dawson Kettering arrived with deputies and found the ruins still smoldering. Vernon Claiborne was never found. No body. No bones. Just a scorched trapdoor and a single phrase carved into the stone beneath it, "You don't lock up love." Eliza never spoke much about those years. Some pain stays locked in places words can't reach. But she stayed in the valley, and the horses stayed with her. And Harlan? He never rebuilt the barn. He left that field untouched, a quiet reminder of what had almost been lost forever. Sometimes, the land remembers what people try to forget.